Welcome to Small College America, a podcast dedicated to exploring the role and value of small colleges in the higher education landscape in the United States. I'm Kent Barnes, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dean Hope.
And today we're honored to welcome Dr. Gary Daynes, Interim President of Salem Academy and College, located in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. With a career devoted to leadership in small colleges, Gary has guided institutions through transformation and written extensively on the field of higher education. He holds a PhD in American history from the University of Delaware. He is also an author of a new book, which we'll talk a little bit about today, How to Be a Small College, a timely guide on how institutions like Salem can thrive by distinctiveness, focus, and community. Welcome, Gary. How are you doing?
I'm well, gentlemen. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Gary, it's great to have you, and we're delighted to have you join us and engage in a conversation. Would love to start with a little bit of background. For those who may not know, can you tell us a little bit about Salem Academy and College, its history, and its unique place in the Winston-Salem community?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you. So, as you can tell by the name, this institution is an academy and a college. It has a girls' day and boarding high school and a women's college together on the same campus. It's the oldest continually operating school for women and girls in the United States. So it was founded in 1772 by the Moravians, who had an early and deep commitment to educating both men and women in equal sorts of ways. So we have carried out that legacy up to the present, both with the academy, again, the girls' day and boarding high school, and with the college. So it continues to be a girls' school and a women's college. Both entities also have important areas of curricular focus. So the academy focuses on STEAM as well as sort of a deep and rich college preparation. And the college is a liberal arts college, but with a focus on health leadership, that is preparing women to lead in improving the health of others, whether that's through their profession as a health manager or a doctor or whatever else, or as a member of a community needing to look for the health and well-being of its members. So that's Salem. We live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We're a small school surrounded by much larger institutions. Wake Forest University is down the road. Winston-Salem State is across the street. Forsyth Tech is in town as well. So Winston-Salem is a rich city, well served by institutions of higher education. And it's uncommon in that we don't overlap with each other. So Wake's students and Salem College's students are quite different, same with Winston-Salem State. So it's a nice ecosystem to be working in.
Great. Well, thank you for that background. I will say that it's one of the more unique setups and organizations that I can think of across the landscape. Gary, you've led and advised many small colleges over your career. You've written a book about it, which Dean's going to talk about a little bit later. But what inspired you to step into the interim presidency at Salem at this particular moment? What attracted you to this really unique institution?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, my wife and I are the parents of four adult daughters, all of whom have indicated at one time or another that they wish they might have had an educational opportunity like the women get at Salem College. So that matters to us as human beings. A second thing is we live in Winston-Salem. Salem had been a consulting client of mine, and I had served the previous president as interim dean of the college, interim vice president for enrollment management. In the way that small colleges work at various other times, I'd led, student affairs and athletics and marketing and, basically all the stuff. So I had some acquaintance with it. But the third reason is that Salem is a place that has been doing for quite some time the things that I think are essential for the future of small colleges. That is, it is distinctive. It is both distinctive in its structure, right? The academy and college together. It's distinctive in its commitment to educating girls and women. And we've doubled down on that commitment. We looked at the mission statements in the last few years and have decided that we will remain committed to educating girls and women, that will be a single-sex institution on into the future. And then we have these areas of curricular focus. So I believe, and I've seen lots of examples of institutions who, by focusing on their distinctives, have found a path through difficult times. And I wanted to be at a place that has done that and, live out the things that I believe as a thinker and a consultant and a member of the higher education community.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Salem and this uniqueness, being one of the oldest women colleges and, of course, the Moravian roots. And I know that there are Moravian schools across the country, not as many as there used to be, but still in the Pennsylvania area and some of the other places. But I'm curious, how do you balance honoring that historical mission, including the identity of a women's college, which I have to imagine is not easy to do these days, while also positioning Salem for the future? And how does women colleges have an identity factor into current enrollment and positioning?
Yeah, that's a cluster of really complicated and hard questions to answer,
Yes, it
Dean.
is.
So, so I appreciate that very much. So let me speak first to tradition. And here I have to acknowledge that I'm a historian. And so I'm jazzed up at being at a school that's 254 years old, right? That speaks to me as a person in a way that it may not speak to somebody else. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is, as I mentioned earlier, the tradition at Salem is a tradition of, first of all, a radical commitment to educating women and girls, and that has been its commitment throughout its time. But because of that commitment, it's also a tradition of innovation. And this is something that we don't always think of together, right? We tend to think of tradition as a limiting factor and innovation as something that's just forward focused. But I've spent some of my happiest moments looking at old college catalogs for Salem and seeing what the curriculum looked like in 1920 or 1950, reading old mission statements. And you can see the way that this institution, dedicated to its core commitments, has changed its curriculum, changed its programs, innovated in offerings, reached out to different groups of students in an effort to live out the mission and to stay current with the educational trends of the time. And so I actually think that the tradition is a great benefit to this institution because it's a storehouse of experience. It points us to paths that could be taken, paths that were taken and didn't work out. And then I guess the last thing I would say is that I believe that education done well has a ritual feel to it, right? I mean, that is there's a reason that you have events that start semesters, that you mark important time points in the lives of students, that we put on our regalia. And I don't think we should look away from those things, right? Those things don't bind us to be backwards looking, but they instead root us in a particular way of approaching learning, of approaching other human beings, of approaching our relationship to those who came before us and those who might follow. And that stuff is incredibly important for the development of human beings. And in some ways, colleges are the last place where that really exists in a deep and powerful way. So we shouldn't abandon it. We would be serving our students and our communities poorly if we abandon the traditions that make us higher education.
Got it. Well, let me do a quick follow-up with that. Um, Being a person who used to be an alumni director centuries ago, one of the things that I'm always curious about with particularly a school that's back in the 1700s, early 1800s, it's not only the tradition, but do you see a number of your graduates sending their daughters to Salem or to the academy? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, we do see that. So there is a rich tradition of legacy students coming to the institution, some of them attending the academy, some of them attending the college. And of course, the alumni of Salem Academy and College are very engaged, deeply committed to the institution. In some ways, we have the sort of an alumni network that would be that most other schools would desire to have because of the depth of the commitment to the institution. That means also that they are willing to ask hard questions of the institution and to say, why are you doing this? So that's part of the deal, right? If you agree that you want your alumni to stay connected to the institution, you've got to be all in responding to their questions, thinking about what their aspirations are, communicating with them richly, so that connection is maintained across time.
Very good. Ken?
I love the fact that you mentioned tradition and history and how important that is. And it's certainly central to ensuring that higher education is not commodified to the degree that it feels transactional. And it relates, I think, directly to your new book, How to Be a Small College. We'd love to know, and we know our listeners would love to know, what motivated you to write it, and what are the central messages you hope small college leaders, faculty, and students take away from your book?
Yeah, so Kent, a couple of things motivated me to write the book. One is when you're in higher education leadership, you need time to reflect. And so this book started as a collection of reflections, me trying to make sense of things that I had experienced or things that I was seeing in the broader field that I thought needed commentary. So that was one of the reasons. The second reason is that I think in general, and here I'm generalizing a lot, right? That the conversation about higher education in the United States overlooks small colleges and particularly small independent colleges. That is, the default assumptions are, whether it's in federal policy or in the media, that one of the things that you ought to be is large and growing, that, you know, every institution that has a sports team is like the University of Alabama. You know, there's just a sort of a gap in our understanding of what higher education does and what all of the models are. And then as both a higher ed leader and as a consultant, I spent time on small campuses doing remarkable work in unheralded ways in places where you wouldn't think that that would take place. And those stories deserve to be told. I mean, if we care about the vitality of rural communities, neighborhoods, and cities, if we care about variety in the types of institutions of higher education that exist, then the stories of small colleges need to be told, and we need to be courageous in defending the things that make small colleges what they are. So that was what was behind the book. You know, I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and I looked one day and I thought, I think there's a book here. And so there became a book.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. You're speaking our language. That's for sure. Are there a couple of central messages that you feel are particularly important that people take away from your reflections on the value of small colleges?
Yeah, thanks, Kent. There are a couple. So first of them is that I argue in the book that the period from 1990 to say 2010, right? It was a period of growth in higher education, economic prosperity, more and more students sending their, more and more families sending their students to college, and more students graduating from high school. That period led small colleges to commit to growth, maybe not above all other things, but above many other things. And that commitment to growth led them to echo or mimic the practices of larger universities. So add new academic programs willy-nilly, brag about how many clubs and organizations that you have, offer all of the high impact practices, start centers, staff up. And those things weren't in and of themselves bad, right? Like if you want to capture more market, you need to do things that might capture more market. But what they led many small colleges to do was to become very complicated, shallow, by which I just mean, I don't mean superficial. I just mean, you know, one person deep offices all over the place. And to have a set of operating expectations that required growth in revenue and growth in enrollment year over year. So that's a bad place to be when public perception of higher education is turning another way, when large universities are capturing more and more of the college-going population, and when you need to be able to stand out in the crowd. So what happened in some ways is that many small colleges became, they lost track of who they were. They lost track of their missions. They became a more expensive, less well-resourced version of a regional public university. So that's not a good spot to be in. But the sort of good part of the story is that nearly every single small college does have in its current operations things that make it distinctive, things that make it truly different. And they're not just rhetorical, right? It's not just like we build relationships between our faculty and our students. There are actual concrete examples of the way that that takes place. So the second part of the book argues that if small colleges are going to flourish, they need to abandon the sort of commitment to grow at all costs. They need to stop seeking prestige as defined by larger, more wealthy institutions, and they need to focus on the things that make them distinctive. That might mean that they get smaller over time, but it will mean that they have a clearer sense of who they are and how to operate and the things that they can deliver to students and their families. And that's what we've got to do. You know, if we are a more expensive, less well-resourced version of a public university, we're losing every single day of the week in the marketplace. Small schools don't have to be that. And I guess the last thing I would say is if you look around at the landscape, both the existing small colleges and startup small colleges, there are super interesting things taking place. And we need to pay attention to those things. This is not a period solely of difficulty, but of innovation, of creativity, of folks figuring out really hard questions on their own. And that's to the benefit of their students, their faculty and staff, and the communities that they serve.
Gosh, Gary, you've channeled one of my favorite CFOs who once in a strategic planning conversation asked the group that was gathered whether or not we could afford what we had become. And I think the first part of your book and the way you've described that is a question that small colleges have to ask themselves right now, especially those that were on the agenda of growth at all costs, add programs here. So I really appreciate that. So look forward to getting your book and reading it. It sounds like a great read. Dean, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, let's kind of keep down this path a little bit. And I mean, you've mentioned that many small colleges are starting to act or have acted like regional mid-state type schools. And one of the arguments, of course, that you just made here, but I want you to go a little bit further with this, is that small colleges shouldn't try to mimic large universities, but embrace their distinctness. What I would like from you is examples of your college and possibly others that have done this well.
Sure, I'd be happy to cite a bunch of examples. So, Salem, again, is a case in point where it has committed to being a women's college with a curricular focus. And that has coincided with a period of enrollment growth. Now, those two things aren't cause and effect. We have also done all of the work that has to be done in a contemporary enrollment management shop to build enrollment. You buy more names, you're more aggressive in your outreach, you're using your CRM to the greatest extent possible. But so Salem is a case in point where a commitment to distinctiveness has led it to be able to attract more students than it was attracting 10 years ago. So there's one example. I think one of the other things that we see is small schools finding ways to operate more efficiently on the back end. So I'm super interested in mergers and acquisitions, but the ones that I'm most interested in are between sort of peer small institutions. So in Iowa, St. Ambrose and Mount Mercy, right, two Catholic universities led by people with a commitment to the endurance of their Catholic missions and realizing, and here I'll cite provost because I used to be a provost, that you probably don't need two provosts for a school of 5,000 students. So those moves towards efficient operations, I think, are really interesting. And then the last thing I would say is that when small schools start to leave behind the notion that they have to offer everything that large institutions do, they become better at certain important things. So Trinity Christian College in one of the suburbs of Chicago decided that the most important thing for its students was to make sure that they had paid internships that would lead to work. And that meant that they were focusing on paid internships and sort of letting other things slide away. They reorganized their academic calendar to make sure that Wednesdays were always open for students to either do an internship or to study. And what they've found is not just greater student satisfaction, better outcomes, lower debt for their students, but also a better sense of well-being amongst their students, fewer visits to the health and wellness center, for instance. So I'm really intrigued at how institutions like Trinity Christian, by picking one thing to be really good at that aligns their students and the mission and the place where they are finding ways to operate that are serving students better. Now, I need to note, in none of these instances does this mean that these schools have become rich. That I think we shouldn't expect that, giant piles of money are going to flow in by becoming more distinctive and focused. But they have found a way to operate in difficult times and to be true to who they are.
I'm really thinking a little bit about your merger and acquisition. As you know, that is the topic of conversation continuously. And I'm curious. I mean, one of the issues that always strikes me about merger and acquisition is usually too late when the merger and acquisition conversation starts happening. It's unusual to find schools that have done this earlier. In other words, while they were both still in some of a good position, because a big sister doesn't need to inherit a weak sister or they both die.
Right.
And so are there any other examples that you've seen where you're seeing that positive side working? I'm just kind of curious about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we should think about these practices along a continuum where at one end there might be an acquisition or a merger. But as you move in the other direction on the continuum, there are deep partnerships that retain the distinctiveness of institutions. So actually, libraries were the first to pioneer this, right? Like it's super expensive to have a good library. And so library consortia made it possible to reduce the costs of library databases and make them available in ways at small institutions that you wouldn't expect given their budget. And there are examples of that, similar sorts of things all over the place. So let me just cite a couple where we are. The students at Salem College can participate in the Wake Forest University Marching Band. Now, that's a small thing, but that was born of two unlike institutions in the same city, figuring out what their common interests were, and importantly, lining up those common interests with the interests of their students. So I expect, Dean, that we will see more mergers amongst equals, but we will also see much more aggressive efforts to line up back-end operations, to share resources in ways that help institutions flourish. And that'll take place on the academic side. So for instance, non-English language instruction is declining all over the place in higher education. Fewer and fewer students are majoring in, say, Spanish or Chinese or whatever else. That's an opportunity for schools to share faculty. Right? Two nearby schools, you still want your students to learn non-English languages, share a faculty member, cut the cost in half. Those sorts of things, I think we will see more and more examples of. And that's actually where I'm looking for examples of success that can be generalized across small colleges.
Very good. Ken?
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate that. And I think that question is on the mind of many. Are we stronger with a partner than trying to go it alone? And we just have to normalize that question at the board level and sort of squeeze out the nostalgia. You mentioned a really interesting opportunity for Salem students to be in the marching band. Tell us a little bit about partnerships and community engagement. In your introductory comments, you mentioned how essential it is to small towns and small communities to be aware of what's happening with small colleges. So Winston-Salem, rich history of higher education, diverse landscape with Wake Forest and Winston-Salem State and Salem, of course. It sounds like you've developed some interesting partnerships with some of these colleges beyond just the marching band opportunity. How are the partnerships you've developed benefiting students at Salem and at the Academy? And what role do you see for those partnerships going forward?
Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about that and then also talk about campus community partnerships, which can be equally beneficial. So one of the things that is true is that it's way easier to make a partnership than to sustain a partnership. And I suspect most registrars' offices have reams of memoranda of understanding that have been signed over time, and no student ever followed that pathway, right? So this is me. I am not saying you should have no partnerships. I am saying choose partnerships wisely and commit resources to staff them. So when Salem College made its commitment to be focused on health leadership, it knew that there were certain health fields that would be very difficult for it to offer, given our budget, our footprint, the costs of clinical spaces and things like that. So we started to partner both with Wake Forest and with Winston-Salem State to provide opportunities for our students. So we have a pathway now for undergraduate students at the college into the nursing program at Winston-Salem State. So instead of starting a nursing program, we thought, for those students of ours who want to be nurses, is there a clear path that they can follow? We also have pathways into master's programs in biotechnology and other sort of clinical health fields with Wake Forest, where there's an overlap of courses in the senior year and guaranteed admission if students meet the admissions requirements. And so those types of pathways, which are pretty common, right, are things that are incredibly valuable, not just for college students, But in order to be able to expand the reach of a small college in ways that it couldn't itself afford, and here I'm not throwing shade at all OPMs, but you can do it in a way that doesn't require you to give away, 40 or 50% of the revenue associated to a third party. So, I think if people wanted to find signs of vitality in partnerships between institutions, they should look at the actual numbers of students who are flowing between institutions, sharing courses, sharing participation activities, matriculating into a new major. So that's what some of the things that we see here in Winston-Salem. Similarly, we have students coming from the community college to Salem under a very generous partnership agreement, because we know that if Salem is going to flourish, we need Winston-Salem to flourish, and community college students provide a source there. And then the last thing I would just say about campus community partnerships is one of the discouraging things in many small towns is when small colleges and the towns duplicate resources that don't need to be duplicated. Like, I don't know how many towns have refurbished their theater at the same time that the college is refurbishing its theater. Makes zero sense. It costs $1 gazillion to build a football field. Seems like you could share with the local high school. All of those things are ways to invigorate the community and to make the college's operations better. So I would expect we'll see more of that kind of resource sharing between communities and the colleges that inhabit them.
Great, thank you. That's a great response, and I love the imaginative thinking about how do we lift all the boats at the same time, especially in those small towns.
Well, this is our last question. We're running out of time, but I want to ask you about this, and I asked many of the people that are on the show about this. I want you to look ahead, not 10 years from now, but I want you to look ahead in the next 5 years. And we all know a little bit about the chaos and all the challenges that are going on, but what gives you the most hope for the future of small colleges in America? I'd like to hear your view on that.
Wow, that is such a good question. And I forgive me if I sound a little bit smarmy, because I get, I love this, right? I mean, I love small colleges, right? So one of the things that gives me hope is the actual human beings who work at small colleges. There are folks of deep and intense gifts amongst the faculty and staff of small colleges who have chosen to be the places that they are, and who are willing to give their lives to the students and the institution and the town that they are in. And that sort of devotion should not be looked away from, right? That is a remarkable sort of thing, and it exists in powerful ways in small colleges where it doesn't exist in many other institutions. So that's one of the things that gives me hope. Go sit down with a student advisor at a small college in rural Kansas. Talk to them about what they do. You will be inspired. So that's one thing. The second thing is examples of small schools who are rethinking themselves while being true to who they are. And I think we see this particularly amongst faith-associated institutions. It no longer does you any good to be nominally associated with a faith tradition. But we see, I think, both in evangelical Christian traditions, as well as in Catholic traditions, and in other non-Western traditions, like at Naropa University, for instance, in Boulder, a deepening commitment to a set of core values that transcend the institution. That is meaningful, right? Even if your denomination is declining, the fact that you believe in something is really, really important. And then the third thing that gives me hope is people doing startup college work. Lots of them fail. Some of them are really bad ideas, but this is just like a fascinating period of innovation in our field where people see the opportunities. They know that learning is essential. They want to be part of forming the lives of their community members and the young people in their town. And they're thinking, well, damn it, I'm going to start a college to make that happen. When I see that happen, it just gives me all sorts of hope, because that's what we need for the flourishing of small colleges on into the future.
It's that entrepreneurial thinking and that spirit of we can do this. So
Yeah.
Appreciate that so much, Gary, and what a great response. So, Gary, thank you very much for being with us today. We're grateful for your perspective, and once again, I just want to mention your book, "How to Be a Small College." Sounds like a terrific read, and I think that our audience will pick that up and learn from you and your perspective and many years of experience. For those of you who are listening, if you'd like to learn more about Small College America, we encourage you to go to our LinkedIn site where you can find details on upcoming episodes, contact us directly, and even suggest guests or topics you'd like us to cover. This episode of Small College America is made possible with underwriting support from Perspective Data Science, a firm specializing in AI-powered tools and data solutions, including the Financial Compass platform. On behalf of our guest, Gary Daynes, my co-host, Dean Hope, and myself, thank you for listening to Small College America.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.